Napoleon wasn't the worst movie of the year, but I have to say that this latest film from one of my favorite directors, who's a big inspiration for me, did not deliver a top-tier film this time. So we need to analyze why from a storytelling perspective so filmmakers like myself can avoid the same mistakes in our own screenplays. And of course, spoilers here on out. Let me say at the outset how much I admire Ridley Scott. Some of Scott's films in the past are a huge inspiration to me, especially as a director, and there are definitely some things about Napoleon that I did like. I really enjoyed the cinematography, as well as the moments of humor that were in the film, seeing the, historically accurate costumes and really well-executed and dramatic battle scenes were very fun to watch because, it's Ridley Scott. He's really good at directing battle scenes. However, I found Joaquin Phoenix's performance to be baffling at times. Sometimes he was very passionate and emotional, or other times he was so stoic that he was unreadable. There's something to be said for an understated performance, but it made it difficult to empathize with Napoleon Bonaparte. And we have to empathize or emotionally understand our characters. You don't have to necessarily like the character that you're watching on screen, but you have to emotionally understand them. And that's the job of a storyteller, is to make me care. And it was hard to care at first since I lacked two specific types of context in this story: plot context and character context. Perhaps in part because I'm an American, I didn't go into the film knowing a lot about the Napoleonic Wars or Napoleon himself. Most of my knowledge of the era comes from Scott's first feature, a movie that I adore, called The Duelists. And we'll get back to The Duelists and how it compares to Napoleon in a bit, so stick around for that. The screenwriter of Napoleon, David Scarpa, is also American, and he said that he had to do a lot of research for the writing of the script. This research and attention to historical accuracy, it turns out, is something that Scott himself really didn't seem to enjoy. And this comes through in the final product that we get. When Scott began to get criticism from historians about the historical liberties taken in the film, he said, well, how would you know? Were you there? And so Scott doesn't care about those type of issues to the point that he decided to insult an entire academic field with his poor epistemology. Now, grumpy Ridley Scott aside, this historical context is somewhat assumed in the film, and because of that, it really undercuts Bonaparte's story. Because these political details are glossed over, it feels to me, as someone who doesn't know a lot, like he's constantly changing sides. And if this is supposed to be a biopic, that's the opposite of what you want. You want to put the viewer in the mind of the person being portrayed. But I couldn't get into Napoleon's mind since I didn't know what was going on or why he was doing what he was doing. As the critical drinker rightly pointed out, a story of this breadth deserves a television show, not a feature film. And the screenwriter David Scarpa freely admits this, saying it was an almost impossible story to tell just in terms of the sheer sprawl of what Napoleon had done and his influence on European history. So it would be almost impossible to tell the definitive version of that story within 2.5 hours. And yet, that's what Scott wanted to do. Contrast this with the current talk of Steven Spielberg doing his own episodic take on the general turned emperor, taking Stanley Kubrick's unproduced screenplay and adapting that into a television show. And if it actually gets made, we'll see how well that compares to Scott's epic when it comes to trying to fit all of these historical pieces in and how accurate it is. Some of the history buffs who watched Napoleon lamented, these historical liberties that were taken with the plot, but that part of it didn't bother me too much precisely because I lacked the historical context. But they definitely do have a point. There's a balance that you've got to strike in your story when you're basing it on real people or events. For example, I'm working on a script right now set in World War II based on a real story, and I've got to walk that line carefully between historical verisimilitude and entertaining embellishment. However, there's more to the story issues with this film than just the outward plot elements and historical issues. I'm talking about the even more important character context that I lacked. Another reason I couldn't seem to empathize with Bonaparte is because I didn't understand his character motivation. His relationship to his mother was supposed to be important, but then we don't meet his mother until much later in the story. We're supposed to know why he finds Josephine so captivating, but we don't see how he really acts around other women before that. Basically, we need Napoleon's backstory. But when we start the film, he's already an artillery officer in command of a huge battle. We start to get some change in his character as he starts out terrified in this battle and then later becomes stoic, but we don't really focus on that. Screenwriter Scarpa started out with a very particular vision which he pitched to Ridley Scott, which Scott really liked. Scarpa says, Before writing the script, I had locked onto this one particular take, and I pitched it to him. The idea of a man who is profoundly capable and confident in the realm of battle, and yet profoundly incapable and incompetent in the realm of love, in the realm of human relationships, and how those two things played off of one another. Now, that is a very strong story spine and could have been a very compelling arc, but that's not really what we're given in the final film. We're supposed to be honing in on what Bonaparte is like, and this film is supposed to be that type of character study, showing that juxtaposition between him as general and him as husband and father. But I didn't get the emotional information I needed to buy into that arc. Looking into the development and the production of the film might give us some clues as to why this might have happened. First, Ridley Scott, being the legendary director that he is, was given a far larger budget than the script originally imagined. David Scarpa talks about when he originally wrote the script and the type of genre he was focusing on and the scale of the film. Scarpa says, these days, you don't get $200 million for something unless it's Marvel or a huge sci-fi film. So I assumed that we were going to do this for $35 million. Going into the original version of it, the movies we had talked about were The Duelists, which Ridley had made, and Milos Forman's Amadeus, which was similar. And lo and behold, it turned out that we had quite a bit more than $35 million. This is an example of what we call in the tech world scope creep. Ridley Scott loves doing the battle scenes, and so when he got the money to do the battle scenes, he did a ton of battle scenes that look super cool, but then distract us from the emotional core of the story that Scarpa set out to tell and originally wrote. Next, Joaquin Phoenix comes to Ridley Scott right before filming and says that he's not sure how to play the role. And then this leads to Scott and Phoenix essentially rewriting the script. Scarpa says that when you're working with somebody like Joaquin, there will be what's in the script, but he has to make it happen on the day. So it has to be something that he spontaneously creates as opposed to something that's set in stone. And Scott goes on to talk about, with Joaquin, we can rewrite the film because he's uncomfortable. And that's kind of what happened with Napoleon. As a director, I'll be the first to tell you that you do have to adapt and improvise on set, but to rewrite the story drastically, as might be the case here, is a recipe for these plot and character context issues. Finally, there's the editing. And with editing, I don't just mean the part that takes place in the editing bay during post-production. I'm also talking about things that are edited on set, because the director is essentially the on-set story editor by deciding what gets shot and what doesn't. And if you look deeper, it turns out that there was a different opening in the script which may have included those character and backstory elements that I found lacking. Talking about the opening of the film, Scarpa said, that's not how we originally started it. That's Ridley's own alchemy. We had a different scene that was 10 pages in, and at a certain point, Ridley decided he wanted to pick that up and move it. Things in this movie got picked up and moved around, changed, and shifted. Now, sometimes that can be a good thing, but it seems in this case, it really had a detrimental effect on the overall impression of the character arc in Napoleon. Now, you might think, well, maybe we'll get that in the 4-hour director's cut that we've heard about, which may in fact contain this lost opening or lots of other scenes that have some of the things that I'm talking about. But screenwriter Scarpa said that that's not an improvement. He said, I've seen what it's like in the longer version, and it works better, like most movies, in its tighter form. There may be more content there, but more content don't necessarily increase context. Let's talk about how to avoid this problem in your own screenplays by looking at two similar films, one of which was Scott's first feature film, called The Duelists. Now, this is an amazing film that I keep coming back to, and this film in turn inspired another film that I also loved while growing up, The Count of Monte Cristo from 2002. In both of these, the story revolves around the relationships between the protagonist and the antagonists, as well as those that each of these characters care deeply about. So let's look at how these differ compared to Napoleon. In The Duelists, we can clearly see that Dubert's life, apart from the duels with his nemesis, adds to the tension of him not wanting to duel constantly, and increases the stakes of what happens if he lives the next time he meets Farad. We see enough of the main character's life apart from the duels that we understand how he acts during the duels. Whereas Napoleon, those two elements seem to be disconnected, other than the same character is doing both things. We don't know why Napoleon is so taken with Josephine, or why she stays with him, even though she doesn't seem to love him. We have interesting scenes where they seem to be in a power struggle with each other, but they just feel disjointed. Even Napoleon's whole focus on his fate as destined to be a great leader, we don't know why he feels that way, or how Josephine fits into that. All of these emotional connections that bring these themes together and these storylines together are missing. Another big issue in Napoleon is his desire for a son, so that he can have a successor as emperor. And he even cheats on Josephine because of it, doing the very thing that he hated her doing to him years earlier. In the Count of Monte Cristo, there's also an affair and a love child, but the child is an actual character, not just a plot device. And his relationship with who he thinks is his father and his real father is central to the story's main conflict, thus raising the stakes and making the conflict between Edmond and Fernand more personal. Contrast that with Napoleon, where once Napoleon divorces Josephine and has a son, he brings his son to her in this touching moment, but then afterwards, his son literally doesn't matter anymore. We never hear about him. Napoleon never mentions him. If he was so important, especially to the Bonaparte-Josephine dynamic, which is the focus of the film, then why ain't he more prominent in the story? I mean, Bonaparte's son was famously raised by his mother in Austria, and Napoleon never got to see him again after his exile. There's a lot of opportunity to explore there. If the film's focus is contrasting Napoleon's nature as a conqueror on the battlefield and ineptitude in personal matters. But we didn't get to explore that because of Scott's choice to broaden his focus into the battlefield and across Napoleon's entire life. And I'm not blaming the screenwriter David Scarpa for this. I'm saying that no matter how good of a job you do as a screenwriter, at the end of the day, it's out of your hands how the film ultimately gets made. Even if you're a writer-director like me, you have to collaborate with other people. And sometimes these creative differences are detrimental to the story that you're trying to tell. From the very beginning of the process, you've got to make sure that you're giving time to develop the contextual themes that you set out to explore. And if you want to walk through on how to do that from the ground up, then I've got a succinct online course that shows you how to quickly and creatively outline a screenplay from the bottom up, starting with characters and themes. You'll learn things like why outlining doesn't hinder your creativity, even though it might feel like it sometimes, how to use character arcs to guide your story structure, and productive ways to break your stories so that you can move forward in them with confidence. This takes my years of writing and what I learned about screenwriting at 2 different film schools and distills it down into bite-sized pieces that you can apply to your own writing process. If you want to make sure that your outline is logical and consistent and character-driven from the very beginning, then go get my course, How to Outline Your Screenplay.